Welcome to our second session of the day. It's entitled Linking Culture to Strategy. As work changes, so must the type of culture that organizations build. The culture of the future will need not only to be engaged, it will need to be agile and aligned to ensure all three across a distributed matrix workforce. An organization strategy must be at the core. Our speaker today is Culture IQ Senior Culture Strategist, Paul Mastrangelo. I think, even though you told me that a few seconds ago, I think I messed it up anyway, Paul. So, Paul, welcome. The floor is yours, sir.
Thanks a lot, Mason. Good day, everyone. Yes, I'm Paul Mastrangelo. I am from Culture IQ. And indeed, I want to talk about linking organizational culture with your business strategy. Or if you prefer a second title, what I really want to think about is, hey, there's nothing soft about your culture. In fact, we're going to talk about in our different points here today. Let me put that right up. What is your organizational culture? How do we define it in general? How can you think about defining the type of culture you need for that link to strategy? What do we mean by strategy? What are some ways to think about that and work with your leaders to think about that? And of course, how do we make some insights into matching the culture with what you need and changing that culture with some action plan ideas? So, there's been, volumes and volumes of books written on this. So let's see how far we can get in 20 minutes today, and then we'll have some questions and we'll go from there. About as good a place to start as any is a quick definition of what we're talking about. And typically when you hear organizational culture, a lot of times you'll hear people say, well, culture, that's the way we do things around here. And there is nothing wrong with that definition, but it glosses over some details. So I want to call your attention to this particular definition here and some key aspects, right? So culture is about employee behaviors. It's what they're doing, but not just any behaviors. It's the behaviors that are what we would call a norm. That's sort of a technical term, so let's break that down. These are behaviors that are recognized as being the way you do things because you look around, you see everyone else doing it, or it's recognized as the right way to behave because we just know that's what you ought to do. And so if everyone's doing it and you know it's what you ought to do, then just everyone around you puts a lot of, if you will, some social pressure on you to behave in a particular way. Now, sometimes a culture has aspects that are just verbally communicated. That's true, although I don't think that just saying, hey, we're going to be a company that does it this way, I don't think that always actually gets into the culture. A lot of what happens is there are aspects of the culture that are unconscious. It's through nonverbal communication. So how are decisions made about who gets promoted? What are decisions about budgets and where the money goes and where the money doesn't go? These are the types of things that send a message, even though it's not really a verbal message. It's about these are the things that are important. I want to break this down a little further. There are certainly some visible aspects of culture. There are some, as I said, communicated aspects, but a lot of times they are things that are, it's like when you get in your car and you're trying to drive someplace and you realize that by accident you've driven to work instead. That's what we're talking about. It's automatic thinking. It's in the subconscious because it just happened. It's so commonplace. So let me give you a quick example. I was at one organization recently, and we were commenting about the coasters that were on the conference table. Coasters, where you put a glass on it so there's not a ring on the table. It turns out that these coasters were in existence because in a previous office space, there was this wonderful mahogany table, the kind of table that you'd see in the C-suite, right? But this table was where employees would gather for different meetings. And it was sort of their big room for employee gatherings and meetings. And so it said so much about the culture because they were very much about putting their best foot forward, being very formal and having high quality prestige. And these coasters, these little cheap little coasters had survived because you've got to make sure that this quality mahogany table is still taken care of. We want to make sure that we're good with the quality in terms of paying attention to details. There were so many hints about that culture in this ridiculous coaster that anyone could see, but it didn't mean you understood the value behind it. So I thought I'd share that just as a way to break into this topic. Okay, let's actually move to the polling question really quickly. If you could respond, who in your organization is responsible for the organizational culture? It might be HR, it might be your CEO. You might say it's everyone, or maybe it's someone else. And as a reminder, when you make your choice, make sure you hit that submit button so that we can actually take a look at the results. We'll give you a couple seconds. So I think I'm seeing this. Oh, gosh. Well, we do have some consensus, don't we? Some of you were talking about HR. About 4 times as many people mentioned the CEO, but a lot of folks, and your numbers are still changing, a lot of folks are saying, boy, it's everyone. You know, it's hard to argue with that because culture is sort of embraces everyone. We're all a part of it. But one of the things we'll talk about is, you know, if there's not one person to go to who says, I'm accountable for making the culture changes, for making it what we want, then it's almost like a diffusion of responsibility. So I agree. In the end, we want everyone to be a part of it. I'm with you. But in terms of the person we've got to go to, we're going to be talking a lot about the combination of our human resource. And when I say human resources, this might be your org development person, your org effectiveness person, whatever that title is in your particular organization. But you know, HR in combination with your CEO and the executive leaders, they're the ones who need to point the finger and say, we want our culture to go there so that everyone can now embrace that. Thanks so much for your input on that. Let's see if we can move on to sort of the approach that we're going to. And you know, I chuckled a little bit with this slide because it makes everything that we're talking about today seem so easy. It's a 3-step process, right? So when we talk about trying to find the match, the link between culture and your strategy, it breaks down like this. First of all, you've got to think about what is the culture that we need. If we know the direction we're going to in terms of our strategy, how do we link that up with those behaviors, those deep assumptions that we're not even thinking about, that are going to make us just drive and do the things that we want the employees to do without them necessarily thinking too hard about it. We've got to make sure that that's right. The second step is you've got to measure the culture that you have. I can't believe how many times I'm hearing leaders, and it's like they think they don't have a culture until the leaders decide that there is a culture. That's not true. You've got one. Whether it was planned or not, anytime you've got a group of people that start working together, there are assumptions about how they interact. You know, it's like the chemistry that you'd see in an athletic team, football or basketball, something like that. You know, I need to know that when I do this, that other person's going to be making this other move. And there's almost like this beautiful symphony in terms of movement. That's culture. That's happening. The question, as we've been talking about, is it the right culture? Now, if you know what you want and you know what you've got, then the third step is, well, what are the changes that we need to make? Now, granted, if you're in a situation where certain behaviors need to flat out stop, we need to do the opposite of what we're doing, that's certainly going to take some time, because that's like, you know, stopping your thought process and thinking, okay, now what we've got to do is make you realize you shouldn't be driving to work, you should be going over here. You can never go in that direction again. We want you to go here. That's going to take some time. And we hear that a lot, right? You know, cultural change takes time. But there are some situations that may not be as severe. It could be that you've got the culture going in the right direction, but you want to amplify certain behaviors. You know, a lot of what I talk about with my clients is it's not so much values, but it's priorities. When do we do this over this other thing? If everything is important, then I don't have any guidance. There must be some sense of when this is being the most important thing, and only after I consider that do I consider some other behaviors. We're going to break that down in just a couple slides and talk in more detail, but obviously this is the direction that we're going. Okay, let's see if I can get the next slide up here. This slide is going to be the first, my first attempt to talk about what do we mean by strategy and how would the culture fit the strategy. Let's forget about those terms for a second, okay? When we talk about the workforce at an organization, there are some things that we know any company in any industry wants to have. And you can see that in the outer ring of that model to the left, right? So we talk about engagement, and we talk about alignment and agility. And what does that mean? Well, think about it like this. In any organization, we need the employees to be energized. We need that energy to be directed towards the right thing. And when the right thing changes, we need the employees to be able to change with it as effortlessly as possible. But there are some aspects, some things that you want from your workforce that are not a one-size-fits-all component. So typically what we do is we'll sit down with the CEO, his or her direct reports, maybe the chief of strategy, and we'll start talking with them, you know, what's your competitive advantage? What do you do that's differently? What's your special sauce, right? And so we try to take those answers and bucket the strategy into one of these 10 different categories. And that's what I'm going to refer to as strategic objectives. So brand excellence, quality, digitization, continuous improvement. There are going to be two that we're going to hone in on in just a second: customer centricity and solution strategy. I think everyone on the call knows that we got to sell stuff, right? So what do we want? Well, we got to sell. But how do we want to sell? Do we want to sell where the customer is the boss? Or do we want to sell the things that we can do sort of in a mass customization? We want to get them to think about what our offerings are more than bending our offerings towards them. Imagine if you say one or the other, the differences in what your employees have to be thinking about, their assumptions, their automatic priorities. That's what we want to get to talk about. So before I get too far down that path, let me show you this next slide as a way of just getting a little bit more, a simpler, I guess, explanation of what we're talking about with culture. Let's think about one specific industry. And I chose the airline industry because we all probably know something about it. Every airline wants to get people from point A to point B. What could possibly be the difference among these airlines? It turns out there's a lot of differences in how airlines operate. So, for example, Delta. Delta is the most profitable public airline on the planet. And this is amazing because they had one of the biggest mergers in the history of the industry. Some of you would remember about 11 years ago, they merged the legacy Delta with Northwest Airlines to form what is now Delta Airlines. And that is considered the standard in mergers across different organizations. So spectacular approach of trying to always have enough standardization that new pieces can plug in, but yet have some differences across the many folks who are, used to different systems. Their culture was aligned towards operating that way. Contrast that with Lucky Air. You may never have heard of Lucky Air. This was, for a long time, a domestic airline that was operating in China. They were a low-cost kind of airline and very successful. Well, guess what? They are now the fastest growing airline in the industry. And what they've done is they've basically chosen to globalize. So they started by offering more and more flights to the European destinations, so Moscow, St. Petersburg, and then now stretching out a little bit towards Southern Asia as well, Thailand, for example. So now they're trying to take what used to be sort of low cost, and now they're thinking about, all right, we've got to expand. We've got to find scalability to do these types of things in brand new locations. And if you really want to think outside the box, I wonder if you've heard of companies like Surf Air or Blade. These are airlines that really aren't what we might think of as airlines at all. So Surf Air is an all-you-can-fly regional service where basically you're buying your flights as if it's a subscription, rather. So I know I'm going to be traveling, and so I just get to sign up for where I want to go in advance, as compared to Blade, which is a charter service where you might take an entire plane, think about the seats you don't need, and share them the same way that you'd have an Uber or a Lyft. That is an innovation and a whole different approach to what airlines is about. And I could go on and on. Qantas is one of my favorite examples. When your airline is operating out of Australia, you better make sure that you've got safety and quality. And sure enough, they do. They're the safest airline for 4 years running. So this is an example of what I'm talking about, where you can be doing the same thing as your competitors, but how you do it, right? And we could talk about this for other industries as well. The auto industry, for example. Let's skip over that. We want to make sure that we're on time today. I promised you that I was going to hone in on two of these strategic objectives. That I would start to use that as an example. So again, customer centricity, kind of an obvious definition here, right? So it is about the customer. We will bend over backwards to do things to get the customers what they want, versus a solution strategy where different products and services are bundled together as an offering to customers. But there's some thinking about, we've got to keep them within these categories. We've got to keep them within the solutions that we're offering, because otherwise we won't have a scalable way of growing, and we may not have the profit margin that we want. All right, let me go into detail here. So the first thing we're going to talk about is this customer-centric strategy. So if your company is moving along these lines, what do we know about companies that are successful or not successful? As it turns out, there's three key success factors: motivation, information, coordination. What does that mean? You need to have a workforce that, right in their DNA, they want to serve people, they want to please people, they want to make folks happy. But they have to be informed as to what do these customers want, what is going to make them happy. And they've got to be able to coordinate with other folks in the organization so that, it can happen profitably and be executed well. Those are success factors for customer centricity. If we think about a solutions approach, it's a little bit different. It's like we're putting some filters in. It comes down to thinking about the way that we create value for the customers and the way we capture that value and deliver it profitably. So, for example, we're going to be thinking about, do we understand the customer? Do we have a way of collaborating with them so we understand what they really need? And then do we have a way of making sure that what we offer to them is, again, scalable, and there's pricing discipline so that we can do so profitably? These are completely different needs for the employee culture. So let me show you what we're talking about. If I were to think about customer centricity with my clients, what would I be talking with them about? Well, some of the things that we would focus on would be, do we put the customer first? Do we optimize customer relationships? And do we have autonomy for each employee to do that? So we might be asking them questions like, hey, is our strategy based on customers? Do you have the ability, the authority, are you empowered to do the things that will please your customers? Those are things that should be embedded, and we'd like to see a lot of folks say, yes, 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 that's exactly what we do and how we do it. Contrast that with a situation where we've got a company that wants to have a solution strategy. Now, the things that we're putting in front of employees are things like, you know what? We actually limit or avoid product customization to keep our costs down. Is it okay for us to say no to the customer in certain situations? Boy, talk about fascinating conversations long before the employees would ever see these questions and I'm talking about this very topic, with CEO and his or her direct reports, and I'm talking about this, and the conversations just start popping up with questions like this. Well, wait a minute, we should be doing this, but are we doing it? And of course, you get someone in charge of sales is saying, look, that's not what our metrics are about. We sell. Okay, and so maybe someone over in operations is saying, yeah, the problem is that we have problems telling the customers we don't have that exactly the way you want. You can see the tension, the conflict, because of one thing being prioritized over the other, and we've got to make sure those priorities make sense. In terms of how employees experience culture, and indeed how you can think about measuring culture, and how you can think about changing culture, I would say that's something that happens throughout the employee experience, the life cycle, right? So think about before folks are even applying to your company, you should actually be thinking about, who's attracted, who is going to sign up for that, that application. How are they onboarded? How are they rewarded? And thinking about when folks leave, are the folks leaving because we're doing a good job changing the nature of the culture, and maybe folks are finding a better fit, or are we losing the best folks for that cultural shift? So I'm running out of time. I'm going to just remind you, these are some of the questions that we put in front of our executives when we're talking about this. What's your strategic objectives over the next 1 to 3 years? What do you think is necessary in the culture to be successful in executing that strategy? And the flip side, right? What are the things that are going to hinder your success, right? So we can start talking about those conflicts. And then finally, are you fostering the behaviors that you need? Are you communicating? And remember, not just verbal communication, even the nonverbal communication. Very, very quickly, so we have time for some questions. I wanted to at least give you some high-level thoughts, because I'm thinking you want to walk away here and say, well, if I actually know the direction that I want the culture to go, how do I change it? And so there are 3 things that I thought I'd suggest and put on the table. The first is thinking about involving employees. And a lot of times when an initiative is launched, and the leader will say, I want that person or that person, or maybe HR will say, let's get volunteers. Yeah, you know what's really better is when you ask the employees, who would you nominate to represent your department, your project, your location, your function? And now all these people who have been nominated, assuming they have time and their bosses say they have time, they're working with the leaders about making the changes that are necessary. So every employee has been involved to a certain extent by nominating someone to be there, making the changes. Pulse surveys. I hear a lot about pulse surveys, continuous listening, but oh my gosh, I get very frustrated because a lot of times leaders think a pulse survey is when you ask the same set of questions over and over and over and over, because we got to measure, we got to track changes. What if it weren't like that? What if the pulse survey could be completely reconceptualized so that now you're not just saying, hey, are we able to say no to the customers? Are we able to say no to the customers now? Now we can say things like, well, have you had a discussion with your team leader about what this means? Have you set a goal, a metric that makes sense where if you're doing a better job with a solution strategy, we're going to see this metric improve, an efficiency metric, for example. Do we have the ability to experiment with how we work with customers, try some new things out? You can ask these things, how are we making changes on a pulse survey? I think it's revolutionary. I think that's where the field is going. And last, as I mentioned, attraction, selection, and then retention. You've got to think about all of these touch points in terms of who comes in, because even though we know you've got to keep a large majority of the folks in your organization, who you actually attract and select and retain, they're having an influence on folks who have been with the company longer. That's how you can start to push a culture in a direction that maybe it's not used to going. So I'm going to stop here. This is the point where I'd love for you to actually bring us some questions. I'll give you some time to populate that, and then we'll let our facilitators maybe guide us through when we've got some good questions available.
All right, Paul, thank you. Great presentation. As you mentioned, definitely some time for some questions. So let me start with the first question here. The HR team has tried to drive culture, but it seems the CEO should be the chief culture officer. How do we get our leaders to own the culture more?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that intuitively leaders think about culture. So there's that classic example of culture eats strategy for breakfast or lunch, depending on what your favorite meal is. But they know that, but a lot of times it's so fuzzy. Again, that's why I talked about that definition. It's what we do around here. If you start talking with them about, look, let's go with your strategy. Where are we going? What are some metrics that would show that we're moving in the right direction? What's our specific goal? In 5 years, we want to have more of this type of person. We want to have a process that's 15% faster. Whatever those things are, it becomes a lot easier to say, all right, what would be the types of things that we want employees to do, or we say we want them to do? Some of them may help us, some of them may hurt. And now it's always brought back to that business. Now, you spoke about HR as well as the CEO and your executive team. I think that HR should own the process. You folks need to be the one, and I say you folks, it's us too, right? We need to be the ones who are saying, look, we understand something about people and the expectations they have. We help facilitate what employees are saying. Think about those peer-nominated folks. They're saying these are the things that are happening, and leaders might have a whole different viewpoint. You've got to be there to help make that work. If you're doing employee surveys, you've got to find a way to take the focus away from, we've got to get question number 22 increased by 10 points. Yeah. That's going to happen if you work on the actual thing that the question is asking about. When you're driving and your gas gauge is on empty, no one actually breaks the gauge and bends the needle back to full. That's not what this is about. You put gas in the tank. So HR can think about the process, but they've got to be working with the leader. And as I said, I think you meet the leaders where they are. If there's something that's keeping them up, if there's a goal that they aspire to, start there. Break that down and link it to behaviors, link it to culture.
Okay. Another question from the audience. How do you assess your culture so you can understand what it actually is? Sometimes there's a difference between what we say it is or what it is supposed to be and what the actual culture is.
Yeah, that is a great point to make. The approach that we use at Culture IQ, we like to look at things from a few different angles. So one approach is to, let's ask employees. Let's create some survey questions. Let's think about what they say on these key aspects. And we've already, I've shown you a little bit, a peek, if you will, at sort of our approach and how that can be done. I think we wouldn't just stop there, however. What we would also do is ask the leaders those questions. Where are we trying to go? What are you trying to accomplish? What is the pattern of results that you want to see? And then we've got to do some other digging. For example, imagine a culture audit where you start to look at different policies, performance management system, for example. If we're about, let's say we take that customer-centric approach, and that means, as we said, we've got to have motivated employees with the right information, and we've got to have them coordinating. Well, do leaders get rewarded for having their teams connect with other people in other parts of the organization? In other words, think about what I'm saying. If I'm the leader, am I rewarded when my direct reports, my team, bypasses me? Because they're going to have a direct contact with folks in other parts of the organization that they should be having to make sure things are coordinated. If there's empowerment, I need to get out of the way. But is that exactly how I am assessed and rewarded? Think about all the things, all the different decisions in terms of policies, procedures, Those are some of the things that you can take a look at. What we do is we take all that information, kind of dump it on the table, and to your point, you say you wanted this, but if that were true, why are we seeing this particular pattern? And of course, that's a lot of times where you really learn the most about culture. When you say you want this, but then you behave in this other direction. And how do employees react to that conflict? Because they see it, and however they're reacting is going to either help or hinder what you're trying to accomplish. So that's a very quick answer, but I think it's accurate. Probably a lot of details I'm skipping over.
Very cool. Well, that wraps us up in terms of time. Thank you again, Paul. Fantastic presentation.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
All right, I invite everyone to join us in the next session. Again, just click on the URL in your email.